The entire palace laughed when the poor girl was dragged into the royal hall wearing a torn dress and carrying a basket of broken flowers. Even the nobles turned away in disgust. The guards were ready to throw her outside before the queen suddenly stood up from her throne. Her face had gone completely pale. She stared at the girl as if she had just seen a ghost from a forgotten past. For 20 years, the queen had believed that the baby she lost was dead. Yet the face standing before her carried a secret that no one in the kingdom knew. The queen ordered every door in the palace to be locked. Nobody was allowed to leave. Nobody understood why. But before the night was over, the poorest girl in the kingdom would discover that the people who had mocked her were standing on a secret that could destroy the royal family forever. The royal palace of Valedria stood above the capital like a mountain of white stone. Its towers were covered with golden roofs. Its gardens stretched farther than most villagers could walk in a day, and its great halls were filled with paintings of kings, queens, princes, and generals who had ruled the kingdom for generations. Every morning, servants crossed the marble corridors carrying silver trays, fresh flowers, folded silk, and polished dishes for the royal family. Nobles arrived in expensive carriages, wearing jewels that could have fed an entire village for a year. In that palace, appearance was almost as important as blood. A person wearing silk was treated with respect. A person wearing rags was often treated as if they were invisible. On the morning when everything changed, a poor young girl named Elara entered the palace through the servants' gate. She was 19 years old, small and quiet, with dark brown hair tied simply behind her head. Her dress was old and carefully repaired in several places. Her shoes were worn, and the basket in her hands contained flowers that were already beginning to lose their freshness. Elara had never dreamed of entering the palace. She had grown up in a small house near the eastern wall of the capital, where her foster mother earned a living by washing clothes for wealthy families. Elara helped whenever she could. She carried water, cleaned rooms, gathered herbs, and sold small flower arrangements in the market. She had never known luxury. She had never owned silk. She had never sat at a noble table. Yet she had something that many nobles had forgotten: patience. For several months, Elara had been working for the palace gardener. She was allowed to enter only the outer gardens, where she planted roses and cared for old trees. On that particular morning, the palace was preparing for the Queen's 20th anniversary celebration. Thousands of flowers had been ordered, but a sudden storm had destroyed much of the royal garden. The chief gardener desperately needed help, and Elara had been asked to bring replacement flowers into the palace. She entered carrying her basket without realizing that the royal family was already holding a morning reception in the great hall. The moment she stepped through the doors, dozens of eyes turned toward her. The hall was crowded with dukes, duchesses, counts, ladies, officers, and merchants. Everyone wore beautiful clothing. Elara looked completely different. Her simple dress immediately became the most noticeable thing in the room. A group of young noblewomen began laughing behind their fans. Several servants exchanged amused looks. One nobleman glanced at her muddy shoes and smiled with open contempt. Elara kept her eyes lowered and continued walking. She had learned from childhood that surviving among wealthy people sometimes meant becoming as invisible as possible. But the basket in her hands suddenly became tangled with the long train of a noblewoman's dress. The flowers fell across the marble floor, a few petals scattered beneath the golden chairs. The laughter became louder. The noblewoman looked at the ruined arrangement with anger, while the other guests watched as though they were witnessing a small entertainment. Elara immediately knelt and gathered every flower. She did not defend herself. She did not complain. She simply collected what remained and placed the flowers carefully back into the basket. Then something unexpected happened. One of the oldest royal servants noticed a small mark on the girl's wrist. It was only partly visible beneath her sleeve, but the servant froze for a moment. He had seen that mark before. Many years earlier, when the palace had been filled with celebrations for the birth of the Queen's first child, the royal family had used a special symbol to identify the newborn princess. It was a tiny crescent-shaped birthmark beneath the left wrist. The servant remembered it because he had been present on the night the princess disappeared. But before he could examine the girl's wrist properly, a palace guard ordered Elara to leave the hall. She stood slowly and picked up the final flower. At that exact moment, Queen Seraphine entered from the eastern doors. The queen was 50 years old, elegant and calm, but the years had left sadness around her eyes. She had ruled Valedria with dignity since the death of her husband several years earlier. As she walked into the hall, she noticed the scattered flowers. Then she noticed the girl. Something about Elara's face made her stop. The queen stared across the crowded hall. Elara lifted her head for only a second. Their eyes met. The queen's expression changed immediately. The color disappeared from her face. She looked at the girl as though time itself had suddenly stopped. The palace became strangely quiet. The queen took one slow step forward. Nobody understood what she had seen. Nobody understood why the woman who had remained calm during wars, rebellions, and political crises now appeared frightened. Her gaze remained fixed on Elara's face. 20 years earlier, Queen Seraphine had given birth to a daughter. The child had disappeared during a terrible palace fire only 3 days after her birth. The official story had always claimed that the baby had died before she could be rescued. Seraphine had never accepted that explanation completely, but she had been forced to live with it. Now, after 20 years, the face of that lost child seemed to be standing before her. The queen slowly approached Elara. Her eyes moved from the girl's face to her left wrist. Elara's sleeve had fallen slightly while she was gathering the flowers. The crescent-shaped mark was visible. The queen stopped breathing for a moment, yet she did not immediately reveal what she believed. Instead, she ordered the palace doors to be closed. Every person in the hall became silent. The guards moved quickly. The nobles looked at one another in confusion. Elara herself stood frozen among the flowers. She had no idea why the queen was looking at her that way. Then the queen turned toward the royal physician, who had served the family for 20 years. The physician immediately understood the seriousness in her expression. He remembered the night of the fire, too. He remembered the newborn princess. He remembered the silver bracelet that had been placed around the baby's wrist. And suddenly, another detail returned to his memory. The bracelet had carried a small crescent symbol identical to the mark he now saw on Elara. But the bracelet had disappeared with the child. The queen ordered the physician to follow her privately. The guests were told to remain inside. Elara was taken to a quiet chamber near the royal library. She still believed she was being punished for dropping the flowers. She could not imagine that the entire history of the kingdom was about to be questioned because of her face. Outside the chamber, whispers spread among the nobles. Some believed the queen had recognized a servant. Others suspected Elara had committed some crime. A few laughed nervously and assumed the poor girl had somehow deceived the queen. But one person did not laugh. Lord Cedric, the queen's most powerful advisor, stood at the back of the hall with a troubled expression. He had been the only senior noble who knew the complete story of the lost princess. He knew something the others did not. If the girl really was the missing princess, then the person who had caused the palace fire 20 years earlier might still be alive. The story of the lost princess had been buried beneath 20 years of silence. On the night she was born, the entire kingdom had celebrated. Bells rang across the capital, soldiers stood along the palace walls, and thousands of citizens gathered in the streets carrying lanterns. Queen Seraphine had waited many years for a child. The birth of a daughter had been seen as a blessing for the kingdom. But 3 days later, shortly before midnight, a fire broke out in the western wing of the palace. The fire spread quickly because several doors had been locked from the outside. Guards rushed to save the royal family, while servants carried water through smoke-filled corridors. In the confusion, the nursery disappeared behind flames. When the fire was finally controlled, the baby's cradle was empty. The official investigation concluded that the princess had died in the fire. No body was ever found. The queen refused to believe that her daughter had simply vanished, but there was no evidence proving otherwise. The royal family eventually announced the death of the child, and the kingdom mourned. A memorial was built in the palace garden. Over the years, the queen learned to hide her grief. She continued ruling, but she never allowed anyone to destroy the memorial flowers. Every year on the anniversary of the fire, she placed a single white rose beneath the statue of the missing princess. Now, 20 years later, that same queen stood in a private chamber with Elara. The young woman was still confused. She had no knowledge of the royal nursery, the fire, or the missing princess. She knew only what her foster mother had told her about her childhood. Elara had been found as a newborn near an abandoned mill outside the capital. A poor widow named Mara had discovered her wrapped in a thin blanket. There had been no parents, no explanation, and no official record. Mara had taken the baby home because she could not leave a helpless child alone. She had raised Elara as her own daughter. For years, Elara had asked about her real parents, but Mara had always said that the truth was lost. She had never mentioned the palace. She had never mentioned the night of the fire. In the private chamber, the royal physician carefully examined the crescent mark. The queen watched without speaking. He then examined several other small features on Elara's face and hands. Each detail matched the descriptions recorded in an old royal document. But resemblance alone was not enough. The palace had seen false claims before. Wealthy families had sometimes presented distant relatives as lost members of royal bloodlines in the hope of gaining influence. Lord Cedric warned the queen that emotion could become dangerous. He secretly feared that someone might have sent Elara to the palace deliberately. The queen understood the danger. She ordered a complete investigation. Elara's foster mother was brought to the palace under protection. Mara arrived frightened and confused. She was an older woman with silver hair and tired eyes. When she saw the queen, she immediately bowed, but when she saw Elara standing beside the royal physician, her face changed. She realized that the secret she had protected for 20 years could no longer remain hidden. Mara had not found Elara by accident. On the night she discovered the baby, a wounded palace servant had reached the old mill carrying the child. The servant had been dying from injuries caused by the fire. He had begged Mara to protect the baby and never reveal her location. He had given Mara a small wooden pendant engraved with the royal crescent. Mara had kept it hidden for 20 years. She had believed that revealing the truth would put Elara in danger. The queen examined the pendant and recognized the symbol immediately. It had been used only by the royal nursery. The pendant contained a tiny compartment, but Mara had never opened it because the metal had been sealed. The queen ordered a royal craftsman to open it carefully. Inside was a small piece of folded cloth. The cloth carried a faded golden thread and part of an embroidered royal emblem. The queen recognized the fabric from the clothing she had prepared for her newborn daughter. Yet there was still no final proof. The royal physician explained that a complete blood examination could confirm whether Elara belonged to the royal family. The process would take time. Until then, Elara remained under protection. News of the mysterious girl spread through the palace. The nobles who had mocked her earlier now became nervous. Some tried to apologize. Others suddenly wanted to become her friends. The same people who had laughed at her dress now admired her courage. Elara noticed the change but did not understand it. She had spent her whole life believing that kindness was something people gave only when they expected something in return. The queen, however, watched her carefully. She noticed that Elara did not ask for jewels, titles, expensive clothes, or servants. She asked only whether Mara would be safe. That simple concern affected the queen deeply. It reminded her of the daughter she remembered holding 20 years ago, yet Lord Cedric remained suspicious. He secretly investigated Mara's history and discovered that the old woman had lived near the palace on the night of the fire. More importantly, he discovered that one royal servant had disappeared after the fire and had never been found. That servant had been responsible for the nursery keys. Cedric began to suspect that the princess had not been lost in the fire. She had been taken. If that was true, then someone inside the palace had betrayed the queen. The investigation became more dangerous when an old archive suddenly disappeared. It contained the original report about the fire. Only a handful of people had access to that room. Lord Cedric immediately understood that someone was trying to destroy evidence. The queen ordered the palace sealed again. Elara was moved to a guarded chamber. She began to realize that her arrival at the palace was connected to something much bigger than a dropped basket of flowers. Meanwhile, the royal physician completed the first stage of the examination. The results showed a strong possibility that Elara was related to Queen Seraphine, but the final confirmation required one more comparison. A sealed royal medical record contained a rare hereditary mark that belonged to the queen's bloodline. If Elara possessed the same characteristic, the truth would become almost impossible to deny. That record was stored in the old royal vault. Only the queen, the royal physician, and Lord Cedric had authority to enter it. That night, while the palace slept, someone entered the vault. When morning came, the royal physician discovered that the record was gone. The disappearance of the royal medical record changed everything. Until that moment, the queen had been cautiously hopeful. Now she understood that someone was actively fighting against the truth. The palace guards searched every corridor, every storage room, and every servant's entrance. No one was allowed to leave the ground. Elara remained under protection, but she could feel the tension around her. She had arrived at the palace as a poor gardener's helper. Within a single day, she had become the center of a mystery involving the royal family. The nobles who had mocked her no longer laughed. They watched her from a distance, trying to decide whether she was an impostor or something much more dangerous. One of the most powerful nobles was Lady Evelyne, a close relative of Lord Cedric. She had spent years hoping that her own son would marry into the royal family. If the missing princess returned, many of her political plans would collapse. She secretly spread rumors that Elara was a fraud. She claimed that the girl had been trained by enemies of the crown. She suggested that Mara had invented the story to gain wealth. The rumors moved quickly through the palace, yet the queen refused to react publicly. Instead, she ordered the investigation to continue quietly. The royal physician examined Elara again. He discovered a faint crescent-shaped pattern beneath the skin near her shoulder, exactly where the old medical records described it. This was stronger evidence than facial resemblance. The queen began to believe that Elara was truly her daughter, but she still needed to know who had taken her. Mara finally revealed the full story. On the night of the fire, she had been living near the old mill. Shortly after midnight, a wounded royal guard arrived carrying a baby. The guard had been badly injured and could barely stand. He gave Mara the child and told her that royal assassins were searching for her. He warned that if the baby returned to the palace, she would be killed. Mara had wanted to take the child to the capital immediately, but the guard begged her not to. He promised that someone loyal to the queen would eventually find them. Then he died. Mara never learned his name. She raised the baby quietly and moved several times to keep her safe. She had chosen the name Elara because she believed the child deserved a name that belonged to no royal family. The queen listened to the story with tears in her eyes. The mystery now had a clearer shape. The fire had probably been a distraction. The princess had been removed from the palace before the nursery burned. But who had ordered it? Lord Cedric continued searching the archives. He discovered that the nursery keys had been signed out by the queen's former chamberlain, a man named Alric Vane. Alric had disappeared immediately after the fire. For 20 years, everyone believed he had died while fleeing the palace, but new records showed that someone had been sending money to an unknown account under his name. The payments had continued for 19 years. Lord Cedric traced the payments to a private estate outside the capital. The estate belonged to Lady Evelyne's family. This discovery seemed to point toward a conspiracy. Yet the truth was more complicated. Lady Evelyne's family had unknowingly inherited the estate years after the original owner disappeared. The financial records had been hidden inside an old chest. Someone had used the estate without the family's knowledge. The investigation therefore moved toward a hidden network rather than one obvious enemy. The queen ordered the old palace servant who had noticed Elara's wrist to be questioned. He remembered another detail from the night of the fire. Before the flames began, he had seen a royal cloak leaving the nursery corridor. The cloak belonged to a senior palace official. At the time, he had assumed the person was helping the queen. Now he realized that the person had been carrying something wrapped in white cloth. The servant had never spoken because he had been threatened. He feared that revealing the truth would destroy his family. The queen finally understood why the original investigation had failed. Too many people had been frightened into silence. The royal physician then made a discovery that changed the direction of the investigation. The rare hereditary mark found on Elara matched the queen's family exactly. There was no reasonable explanation except royal blood. The queen no longer doubted that Elara was her daughter. But before she could announce the truth, someone attempted to remove Elara from the palace. A group of men disguised as palace guards entered her chamber during the night. They carried forged orders claiming that the queen had sent them to move her to a safer location. Elara followed them through a side corridor because she believed they were protecting her. But one of the real guards noticed that their uniforms carried an outdated royal emblem. He stopped them before they reached the outer gate. The men escaped through a hidden passage. The discovery proved that someone inside the palace was helping them. The queen became furious. She ordered every hidden passage searched. Behind an old tapestry in the western corridor, the guards found a narrow staircase leading to an abandoned room. Inside were boxes containing old letters, royal seals, and documents connected to the night of the fire. One letter mentioned a secret plan to remove the newborn princess and place a different heir in her position. The name of the person who had signed the order had been scratched away, but the royal seal remained. The seal belonged to the queen's late husband. The queen was devastated. Her husband had always been believed to be innocent. If the seal was genuine, then he might have known about the plan. But the queen remembered something else. During the months before the fire, her husband had become increasingly distant. He had secretly met several nobles and had argued with the palace council. At the time, she had believed it was political business. Now she wondered whether he had discovered the conspiracy before his death. The final letter contained a strange phrase about protecting the kingdom from a future succession crisis. It suggested that the person behind the plan had believed the newborn princess would cause a civil war. But there was a second possibility. Someone might have forged the king's seal to make him appear guilty. The queen refused to accept either explanation without proof. She ordered Lord Cedric to investigate the late king's private archives. Meanwhile, Elara discovered something in Mara's belongings that nobody had noticed for 20 years. It was a small piece of blue ribbon sewn into the lining of the old blanket that had wrapped her as a baby. On the ribbon was an embroidered royal symbol. Beneath the symbol were 3 tiny letters. They matched the initials of the queen's lost daughter. For the first time, Elara understood that her entire life had been built upon a secret. She was not simply a poor girl who had entered the palace by accident. She was the missing princess. Yet the most dangerous question remained unanswered. If the queen truly was her mother, why had someone spent 20 years making sure she never returned? The queen spent the next several days studying every document connected to the old fire. The palace celebration was cancelled, and the kingdom was told that the royal family was dealing with a serious internal matter. Outside the palace, citizens began to speculate. Some believed the queen was ill. Others believed there had been an attempted coup. Nobody knew that the missing princess might have returned. Inside the palace, however, the truth was becoming harder to hide. The royal physician had completed the final examination. Elara carried every known physical marker of Queen Seraphine's bloodline. The evidence was overwhelming. She was the lost princess. The queen finally allowed herself to accept what her heart had recognized the moment she saw the girl's face. She had found her daughter, yet happiness was immediately followed by grief. The queen realized that she had lost 20 years of her child's life. She had not watched Elara take her first steps. She had not heard her first words. She had not seen her grow up. She had missed every birthday. Those years could never be returned. Elara also struggled with the truth. She had spent her entire life as a poor girl and suddenly learned that she belonged to the royal family. But the queen did not force her to change. She understood that a crown could not erase 20 years of memories. Elara still cared about the people who had raised her. She still remembered the market, the old mill, the garden, and the small house where she had grown up. The queen decided that if Elara became part of the royal family, she would never be forced to abandon those memories. While mother and daughter slowly began to understand one another, Lord Cedric uncovered the final piece of the conspiracy. The late king had indeed known that someone wanted to remove the princess, but he had not ordered her disappearance. He had discovered that several powerful nobles planned to use the newborn princess as a reason to divide the kingdom. They intended to kidnap her, blame the attack on foreign enemies, and create fear among the people. Their plan was to force the king to surrender certain powers to the council. The king had secretly prepared evidence against them. He had used his royal seal to authorize a hidden investigation. Unfortunately, someone inside the palace betrayed the investigation. The fire was then created to destroy the evidence and make the princess appear dead. The person who carried the baby away was a loyal guard working for the king. That guard had reached Mara's mill and died from his injuries. The conspiracy had continued after the fire because several nobles feared that the princess might still be alive. Lord Cedric traced the old financial payments again. This time, he found the name of the person who had been sending them. It was Alric Vane, the former chamberlain. But Alric was not dead. He'd been living under another name in a remote village. Royal guards found him and brought him back to the capital. His testimony revealed the darkest part of the story. He had been ordered to steal the baby by a group of nobles who believed the monarchy would become too strong if the princess survived. He had taken the child from the nursery, but had lost control of the situation when the king discovered the plan. The fire had been started by another conspirator. Alric had escaped because he feared execution. For 20 years, he had lived in hiding while accepting payments from the people who wanted the secret buried. He eventually revealed that one member of the original conspiracy was still alive inside the palace. The queen immediately ordered a secret gathering of senior officials. Everyone connected to the old council was investigated. The evidence eventually pointed toward Lord Cedric himself. The queen was shocked. She had trusted him for years, yet the evidence appeared convincing. He had access to the archives. He knew about the lost princess. He had been one of the few people who could enter the royal vault. He had also known that Elara was the missing princess before anyone else. But the truth was not what it seemed. Lord Cedric had deliberately allowed suspicion to fall on himself because he had been secretly investigating the surviving conspirators. He had discovered that the palace had been infiltrated years earlier. He had hidden evidence in different locations because he feared that the documents would be destroyed if kept together. The missing medical record had not been stolen by him. He had moved it to a secret location after realizing that someone was searching the vault. He finally produced the record. The evidence confirmed Elara's identity beyond any doubt. The Queen then faced one final decision. She could announce Elara as the lost princess immediately, or she could first expose the remaining conspirators. She chose the second path. She understood that revealing Elara's identity too soon could put her in danger again. The remaining conspirators believed the princess was still hidden. The Queen decided to use that belief against them. She announced that the investigation had failed and that Elara would be sent away from the palace. The news spread quickly. The nobles who had once mocked the poor girl celebrated her supposed removal. Lady Evelyne believed her political future had been saved. Several members of the old council began moving their assets out of the capital. They believed the secret was safe. But the Queen had secretly placed guards around every person involved. The plan worked. One by one, the surviving conspirators met in an underground chamber beneath the old council hall. They believed they were discussing how to permanently protect their power. Instead, royal guards surrounded them. The Queen entered with Lord Cedric and Elara behind her. The conspirators realized too late that the poor girl they had underestimated was the very person they had spent 20 years trying to erase from history. Their faces changed when they saw the Queen standing beside her. The palace guards seized the conspirators and confiscated their documents. The Queen then ordered the old council hall open to the public so that the truth could no longer be hidden. But one final revelation remained. Among the confiscated documents was a letter written by the late king. It had been sealed for 20 years. The letter was addressed to the daughter he believed might one day return. It contained the reason he had never stopped searching for her. The letter revealed that the late king had believed his daughter was alive. He had spent the final years of his life searching secretly for her. But he had never found Mara because the conspirators had destroyed the records connected to the old mill. He had written the letter in case he died before finding her. The letter did not speak about crowns or political power. It described his hope that his daughter would grow up surrounded by people who valued kindness more than wealth. The Queen read the letter privately before giving it to Elara. For the first time, Elara felt connected to the father she had never known. She had spent her entire life wondering why she had been abandoned. Now she understood that she had not been abandoned. She had been stolen. The difference changed everything. The Queen decided to reveal the truth publicly. The announcement was made in the central square of the capital. Thousands of citizens gathered around the palace gates. The Queen appeared on the balcony with Elara beside her. The people had expected news about the palace investigation. Instead, they learned that the lost princess had survived. The crowd became silent. Many citizens remembered the memorial built for the princess 20 years earlier. Some had brought flowers there every year. Now they realized that the person they had mourned had been alive all along. The Queen introduced Elara as Princess Elara of Valedria, the daughter who had been taken from the royal family as a newborn. The announcement changed the kingdom overnight. But Elara's greatest challenge was not accepting the title. It was facing the people who had mocked her inside the palace. The same nobles who had laughed when her flowers fell now stood before her in formal clothing, desperate to show respect. Some had mocked her because of her dress. Others had treated her as though she were worthless because she was poor. Now they were forced to confront their own behavior. The queen did not punish every person who had laughed. Instead, she required them to witness a new royal ceremony. The palace would no longer judge servants or citizens by their clothing. Elara personally asked that the royal gardens become open to workers and poor families on certain days. She wanted the palace to become less distant from the people. The queen supported the idea. She believed that her daughter's years outside the palace had taught her something the royal family had forgotten. Elara knew how ordinary people lived. She understood hunger, work, loneliness, and kindness. She had seen people with nothing share their last piece of bread. She had also seen wealthy people refuse help to those who needed it. Her experience gave her a different understanding of leadership. Yet happiness did not arrive immediately. Elara still felt uncomfortable in royal clothing. She did not know how to behave at formal dinners. She sometimes woke early and walked through the palace gardens because the silence reminded her of the old market. The queen never forced her to become someone else. Instead, she slowly introduced her to royal traditions. Mara was given a comfortable home near the palace and treated as a respected member of the royal household. Elara visited her often. The queen also came to see Mara, grateful to the woman who had protected her daughter for 20 years. The palace gardener was promoted because he had unknowingly brought the missing princess into the royal hall. The old servant who had recognized the crescent mark was honored for finally speaking about the night of the fire. The royal physician became responsible for preserving the truth of the royal family's history. Meanwhile, the conspirators were placed on trial. Their crimes were documented publicly. The kingdom learned that the palace fire had not been an accident and that the princess had been deliberately removed. The trial also revealed how powerful people had used fear and wealth to silence ordinary servants. This became an important lesson for the kingdom. The queen changed several laws to prevent powerful families from controlling royal investigations. She also created a system through which servants could report corruption without fear of punishment. Elara supported these reforms because she knew what it felt like to have no power. But one person still remained in prison awaiting judgment: Alric Vane. His testimony had helped reveal the conspiracy, but he had also participated in the kidnapping. Elara visited him once. She did not excuse what he had done, yet she learned that he had lived for 20 years with fear and regret. His confession became important evidence in the trial. The queen eventually ordered that his punishment reflect both his crime and his cooperation in revealing the truth. The story of the lost princess gradually became known throughout the kingdom. Children heard it from their parents. Merchants told it in markets. Travelers carried it to distant villages. But Elara did not want to be remembered only as the princess who returned. She wanted to be known for what she would do with the life she had been given. She began working with the palace gardens and created a program for poor children who wanted to learn gardening, reading, and basic skills. She believed that talent could exist anywhere, even in places the palace never noticed. The queen watched her daughter grow into her new role. One evening, they walked together through the royal garden. They stopped beside the memorial statue that had stood there for 20 years. Beneath the statue was the white rose the queen had placed every year for the daughter she believed she had lost. Elara touched the stone gently. The queen then removed the old memorial plaque. It had once carried the words that described the princess as dead. The plaque was replaced with a new one that recorded the truth. The princess had not died. She had survived. She had grown up far from the palace, and she had returned not because she wanted power, but because the truth had finally found her. Yet the most beautiful part of the story was still waiting to happen. The queen had planned one final ceremony for the anniversary of the fire. It would not be a celebration of royalty. It would be a celebration of survival. She wanted the entire kingdom to see the girl who had once entered the palace carrying broken flowers. The girl everyone had mocked would now walk through the same hall as the rightful princess. But the queen had another surprise. She had discovered something hidden inside the original royal nursery. The item had been sealed behind a stone panel that no one had opened for 20 years. It was a small wooden cradle decoration carrying the exact same crescent symbol as Elara's birthmark. Inside it was another letter. The letter had been written by the queen on the day her daughter was born. It described a tiny hope that one day her daughter would grow up kind enough to see beyond titles. The queen realized that, despite everything that had happened, the wish had already come true. The anniversary ceremony began at sunrise. The palace gates were opened, and citizens from every part of Valedria were allowed to enter the outer gardens. For the first time in decades, servants, farmers, merchants, craftsmen, nobles, and royal officials stood together beneath the same banners. There were no separate entrances. There were no special paths reserved only for wealthy families. At the center of the palace garden stood the old memorial. The statue remained, but the sadness surrounding it had disappeared. White flowers covered the ground around it. Queen Seraphine arrived wearing a simple royal dress. Beside her walked Elara. The young woman wore a beautiful gown, but it was not covered with excessive jewels. She had chosen a small crescent pendant, the same symbol that had been hidden inside the wooden box for 20 years. As they entered the great hall, many of the nobles lowered their heads. Elara remembered the morning when she had first walked through those doors. She remembered the laughter. She remembered the flowers falling onto the marble floor. She remembered the way people had looked at her torn dress. At that time, she had believed the palace was a place where she would never belong. Now she understood something different. Belonging had never been about clothing. It had been about truth. The queen stood beside her daughter before the entire court. The royal physician presented the historical evidence confirming Elara's identity. Lord Cedric presented the documents, proving that the princess had been taken during the palace fire. Mara was brought forward and publicly recognized for protecting the child. The palace servants who had once known Elara as a gardener's helper watched with tears in their eyes. Some remembered how she had quietly helped them when nobody was watching. Others remembered how she had shared food with workers even when she had very little herself. The nobles who had laughed at her could no longer pretend that they had always respected her. Their shame was visible. Yet Elara did not use the moment to humiliate them. She understood that revenge would not repair the years she had lost. Instead, she asked the queen to make the ceremony a beginning rather than a punishment. The queen agreed. A new royal foundation was created in Elara's name to support children from poor families. It provided education, food, and opportunities for young people who had been overlooked because of their social position. Elara became its patron. She visited schools and villages throughout the kingdom. She listened to people who had never been invited into royal halls. She remembered what it felt like to be ignored. Over time, the people began to love her, not because she was the princess, but because she understood them. The queen remained on the throne for many more years, but she gradually gave Elara greater responsibilities. The young princess became known for solving problems with patience rather than pride. She never forgot the palace gardener who had once trusted her with a basket of flowers. She never forgot Mara. She never forgot the old servant who had finally found the courage to speak. Most importantly, she never forgot the morning when everyone had laughed at her. That memory became one of the greatest lessons of her life. A person's value could not be measured by clothing, money, or social position. The palace had taught her that lesson in the hardest possible way. 1 year after the ceremony, Elara returned to the same hall where her flowers had fallen. The marble floor looked exactly the same. The golden chairs remained. The paintings still covered the walls, but the atmosphere had changed. The queen had ordered that the hall be used for public meetings several times each month. Servants could enter through the main doors. Workers could speak directly with royal officials. The palace was still grand, but it was no longer completely closed to ordinary people. Elara walked to the center of the hall and looked down at the floor. She remembered the scattered petals. Then she smiled. Those broken flowers had once seemed like a disaster. Instead, they had led her to the truth. The queen joined her. Mother and daughter stood together beneath the royal crest. Neither of them needed words to understand what the moment meant. 20 years had been lost, but the future remained. The mystery of the missing princess had finally ended with a reunion rather than a tragedy. The kingdom had learned that the poorest person in a room could carry the greatest secret. The nobles had learned that arrogance could blind people to the truth standing directly in front of them. And the queen had learned that sometimes the person we spend years searching for may arrive quietly, carrying nothing more than a basket of broken flowers. Years later, when Elara eventually became queen, she kept the old basket in a glass case inside the palace. It was not made of gold. It was not decorated with jewels. It was an ordinary basket, worn from years of use. Beneath it was a small plaque explaining that the basket belonged to the girl who had once entered the palace without a title. The story became famous across Valedria. Parents told their children that wealth could disappear, titles could change, and power could be taken away, but character remained. The old palace servants remembered the day when everyone had mocked the poor girl. They also remembered the moment when Queen Seraphine recognized her face. That moment had changed the kingdom. But the deepest secret was not that Elara was a princess. The deepest secret was that the kindness she had learned while living as a poor girl was exactly what the royal family needed. The palace had spent 20 years searching for a lost princess. What it finally found was something greater. A future queen who understood both sides of the kingdom. She knew what it meant to sleep beneath a simple roof and what it meant to walk beneath a golden ceiling. She knew how people looked at the poor and how they looked at royalty. Because she had lived both lives, she could see the kingdom from a perspective no ruler before her had possessed. And that was why the girl everyone had laughed at became one of the most respected queens in Valedria. The story that began with broken flowers ended with an entire kingdom changing the way it saw people. The palace never forgot the lesson, neither did Elara. Whenever a new servant entered the great hall wearing old clothes, nobody laughed. Whenever a poor child stood outside the palace gates, the guards no longer automatically turned away. The doors were opened, the people were heard, and above the throne, beside the royal crest, Queen Elara placed one small image of a white flower. It reminded everyone that the greatest turning points in history do not always arrive with armies, crowns, or grand announcements. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through a forgotten girl carrying a basket, while an entire room is too proud to see who she really is.